What would you do if the only inheritance the world allowed you was a name it had already decided to despise? In the spring of 1889, in the Red Rock Canyon country of the Arizona Territory, a girl of 19 stood at the edge of a town that did not want her, with $4 folded into her glove and a surname that closed every door before her knuckles could reach the wood. Her name was Clara Vane. In that valley, the name meant a single thing. It meant the swindler's grandchild. It meant the blood of the man they swore had stripped 100 families of everything they had saved and then walked off into the heat and left them with the empty promise of a harbor that was never dug. She had not done the thing they hated her for. She had not yet been born when it was done. But a name runs ahead of the truth, and hers had gone before her into every store and chapel and kitchen for as long as she could remember. Settle in for this one, friend, and let the canyon dust settle with you, because before this story is finished, you are going to learn how a 30-ton coastal war gun came to rest on the floor of a canyon that no wagon could enter, why its bronze still gleamed after 20 years with no keeper listed on any county book, and what her grandfather had sealed inside the iron powder magazine buried beneath it, the one vault no thief would force and no fire would ever dare come near. Wherever you are listening from tonight, a quiet kitchen, a long stretch of road, a porch with a lamp left burning, stay with us a while and tell us in the comments what corner of the country you are watching from. There was an old saying in that county, spoken by men who had seen a great deal and explained very little. A gun that never fired still keeps its promise. Clara did not yet know that the promise was hers to keep. She knew only that she was cold and hungry and entirely out of places to go. The aunt who raised her had not been cruel so much as worn thin. She was her mother's sister, a widow with a leaking roof and a garden that gave less each year, and for 11 winters she had kept the girl fed on beans and hard bread and a silence that grew heavier with every mouth the drought closed around them. When the last of the money went, the aunt sat Clara down at the plank table and did not look at her. "There's not enough, child," the old woman said. "There was never going to be enough, and the name you carry costs me more than the food does. You understand me. Nobody will hire a Vane. Nobody will sell to me if you are seen at my door." Clara understood. She had understood for years in the sideways looks and the shortened conversations and the schoolmaster who had seated her apart from the other children. She packed a canvas satchel with a comb, a folded dress, her mother's small tin of buttons, and the 4 silver dollars the aunt pressed into her hand as a last apology. Then she walked out into a morning so bright it hurt, 19 years old, with the whole valley at her back and nothing in front of her but the road. She might have kept walking, out of the county, out of the territory, to some place where the name Vane meant nothing at all. Many would have. But there was a notice nailed to the post outside the county seat that stopped her cold, because it carried her grandfather's disgrace and her only chance in the same few printed lines. It was a bill for the county tax sale. Once a year the assessor auctioned the parcels whose owners had died or fled or simply given up paying, and the list this year was long and poor. Sun-cracked homesteads, a dry well and the acre around it, a collapsed livery, and at the very bottom, in smaller type, as if the clerk himself had been embarrassed to set it, one lot that the whole valley knew by heart and nobody had ever bid on. The war gun in the wash. Clara stood before the notice a long while. She had grown up hearing about the gun as other children hear about ghosts. It sat out in a box canyon east of town, a monstrous old cannon that had come from nowhere and belonged to no one, mounted above a harbor that did not exist, guarding a sea that was 600 miles away. It was the bones of the fraud that had ruined the valley and made her name a curse, and it was, the notice said, available to any bidder who could produce the back taxes owed, which after 20 years of nothing came to the almost comical sum of a few dollars. She had 4. The sale was held on the courthouse steps in the flat white glare of noon, and a small crowd gathered, less to buy than to watch their neighbors lose things. The auctioneer moved through the good lots first. The well, the livery, a wagon, and men in clean collars bought them cheap. Then he came to the bottom of his list, and his voice took on the lazy scorn a man uses for a joke everyone already knows. Lot the Last, he called. The ordnance piece and emplacement in the East Wash, so-called Port Meridian Battery, together with such ground as no surveyor will swear to. Back taxes of $3.60. Do I hear a bid, or do I hear laughing? He heard laughing. It rolled across the steps easy and mean, the laughter of people who had learned long ago to make their loss into a joke before somebody else could. A cattle agent leaning on the rail called out that he would give a nickel to have the thing hauled off his memory. A woman in black said the only fitting buyer was already in a shallow grave if the coyotes had left him one. The auctioneers smiled and let them run, because a crowd that is laughing is a crowd that is staying. Come now, he said. A cannon for a harbor God forgot to fill, going once for the price of a bad supper. $3.60, said Clara Vane. The laughing stopped the way a lamp stops when the wind takes it. Heads turned. It took the crowd a moment to place her, and then a whisper moved through them, and the whisper had her name in it, and the name pulled every face into the same expression, half disgust and half delight, because the swindler's own grandchild had just stepped up to buy the swindler's monument with silver nobody could imagine she owned. The auctioneer recovered first. He looked at her like a man staring at a card he did not expect to be dealt. "You have got the coin, girl?" She opened her glove and laid the last of her silver on the rail, coin by coin, and kept her spine straight while she did it, and did not spend the rest, 40 cents. That was what she would have left in all the world when the gavel came down. "Sold," the auctioneer said, because the law gave him no other word to say. To the Vane girl. God help her, and God help the gun. Nobody clapped. A boy near the front asked his mother, loud enough to carry, why anyone would buy the thief's cannon, and the mother hushed him and did not answer, and Clara took the paper the clerk made out and walked down the steps through a silence that pressed on her like a hand. She had spent nearly everything she owned to buy the most hated object in the valley. She told herself she would sell the iron for scrap, take whatever a foundry would pay for 30 tons of old metal, and leave this country forever with a stake in her pocket instead of shame. That was the plan. It was a good, cold, sensible plan, and it lasted exactly as long as it took her to walk out to the wash and see what waited for her there. Stay close now, because the moment Clara Vane first laid eyes on her inheritance is the moment this stops being a story about a ruined name and becomes a story about the promise a dead man left burning in the rock. The road out to the wash was not a road at all after the first 2 miles. It was a memory of a road, a wagon grade that climbed toward the mouth of the box canyon and then stopped as if the earth had bitten it off, and the reason it stopped was plain even to a girl who knew nothing of engineering. Someone had blasted it shut. A whole shoulder of red stone had been brought down across the only grade wide enough for freight. And the rubble had lain there so long that brush had grown up through it, and the scar had gone the same rust color as the cliffs. To go on, Clara left the mule she had hired against her 40 cents at the foot of the slide and climbed over on foot, Satchel banging her hip, and came down the far side into a canyon so still and so hot that her own breathing sounded like an intrusion. And there it was, the war gun in the wash. For a moment the size of it stopped her heart, because from the courthouse gossip she had built a monster in her mind. And here in the flesh, the monster was real. A colossal iron barrel, banded and blackened, wider around than she was tall, lay canted across a slope of cracked pale mud on a carriage of cast iron so heavy it seemed to have grown out of the ground. The muzzle was heaved up and pointed down the empty canyon at nothing, at heat shimmer and dead brush and a wall of red stone aimed forever at a sea that would never come. It was exactly as impossible as they said. No fort, no road, no water, no reason. 30 tons of naval iron sitting on the floor of a desert canyon 600 miles from any coast, as though God had set it down and forgotten where. But the closer she came, the smaller the monster grew, and the letdown came down over her like cold water. The great emplacement of stone beneath the carriage had crumbled and given way, so that the whole gun had slipped and settled hard off its true mount. One iron wheel collapsed and sunk deep in the dried mud. Drift sand banked up against the trail arms. The barrel was pitted and sun-silvered, scabbed with 20 years of rust. The carriage timbers that were not iron had caved and split. This was no fortress. This was a carcass. This was a dead thing rotting in a hole, and she had spent nearly every cent she owned on it. "So this is it," she said aloud, to no one, and her voice cracked flat against the stone. "This is the fortune of the Vane family, a broken gun in a dry ditch." She sat down on a rock and let herself feel it, the full weight of the joke the whole county had been laughing at, and the joke was her. She could not even be sure a foundry would send a crew over that blasted grade to cart the iron out. She might have bought a monument to her own family's shame and be unable to sell so much as a bolt of it. 40 cents. A broken cannon. A cursed name. She put her face in her hands, 19 years old, and came very close to weeping. It was the smell that stopped her. Wood smoke, faint, thin, alive, the smell of a fire that had burned recently and been carefully banked, drifting up from somewhere below the canted gun. In a canyon with no house, no road, no soul on any county book, no keeper, no living thing but lizards and the girl herself, someone had lit a fire, and lit it lately, and put it out with the patience of a person who meant to light it again. Clara lowered her hands and went still, the way prey goes still. She stood, slowly, and made herself walk toward the gun. And now that she was looking, not grieving, she began to see the thing that the rust and the ruin had hidden from her. The great machine was decaying everywhere her eye first fell, rust-streaked, sand-drifted, sun-bleached. But it was not decaying evenly. In among the ruin were places that had been kept. The bronze sight mounted along the barrel did not have the green film of 20 forgotten years on it. It gleamed. It threw a hard, bright spark of noon sun straight into her eye, oiled by a hand, and recently. The breech band at the base of the barrel had been rubbed clean of rust in a wide worn patch, bright as a stair rail, worn smooth where 100 hands have gripped it. The vent, The touch hole where a gun of that age took its fire had been swept clean and kept clear. And down in the rocks beside the gun's sunk base, sheltered and half hidden, was a small ring of stones cupping a bed of gray ash. And when Clara knelt and laid her fingers against it, the ash in the center of that ring was warm. Someone tended this gun. Someone loved this dead and hated thing, secretly, faithfully, for what her whole life told her had been 20 empty years. And whoever they were, they had been here today. That was when she saw the hatch. The collapse of the stone emplacement had done more than tip the gun. In heaving the carriage off its mount, it had cracked open the ground at the gun's base and exposed, set flush into the living rock of the canyon floor, a squat and heavy iron door. A magazine hatch. Clara knew it for what it was the moment she saw it, because the whole county knew this part of the story too. Told in whispers to frighten children. Beneath the coastal guns of the real world, the ones that stood over real harbors, the powder was kept in sunken chambers cut into the rock, so that no spark could reach it and no blast could carry to the gun above. And this gun had one, a proper sunken powder magazine sealed by an iron door buried in the stone beneath the carriage. And the valley had sworn for 20 years that the magazine was still full of tons of old black powder gone unstable and cruel with age, powder that would take the arm off any fool who tried to crack the door, powder that no thief had ever dared to force and no fire had ever dared come near. It was the reason, folks said, that even the boldest scavengers had left the gun alone. You did not pry at a door with death packed behind it. Clara crept closer to the hatch, and her breath went short, because the door was not merely shut, it was fastened. A thick disk of dark red sealing wax had been pressed over the seam where the iron door met its frame, and stamped deep into the wax, clean and unworn, was the mark of a hand-cut die, a device she had never seen in her life. Not a county seal, not an army mark, not any brand she knew from a lifetime in that valley. A private die, cut by one hand for one purpose, pressed into wax that the desert sun should have cracked to powder years ago and had not, because someone kept it whole. She knelt there in the heat, and she could not stop looking at it. She did not know what the mark meant. She did not know whose hand had cut it. But something in the sight of that small, clean seal, tended and guarded in the middle of all that ruin, reached into her and would not let go, and she understood, without words for it yet, that she was not going to be able to sell this gun for scrap and walk away. Not until she knew who lit the fire and what the seal was for. So here is a question for you before we go on, and I would truly like your answer in the comments. Would you open a magazine the whole county swears will kill you, to clear the name of a dead man you never met, when the truth you dig up might name the powerful family that still runs the valley you have to live in? Would you pry at that door, or would you take your 40 cents of scrap and go? Think on it while Clara decides, and if this is the kind of story you were hoping to find tonight, take a moment now to subscribe and settle in, because the Kenyon is about to give up the first of its secrets. Clara did not open the hatch that day. She had no tool that could have cracked it, and more than that, she was afraid. The honest animal fear of a girl told all her life that death lay behind that iron. But she could not make herself climb back over the slide and leave. Instead, she did the thing her whole life had trained her to do when she had nowhere to go. She stayed. She found a hollow in the rock out of the wind, spread her folded dress for a blanket, and settled in to watch the fire ring. Because a fire that warm would want tending again by nightfall, and whoever came to tend it would answer more than any door. She waited through the long copper afternoon and into the blue hour when the heat let go of the stone. And as the first stars pricked out over the canyon rim, she heard it. Not footsteps. A slow, careful scuff and tap, coming down out of the rocks above the gun, and then a shape, bent and small, moving with the terrible patience of the very old or the very blind, feeling its way along the great iron carriage with one hand as if the gun were a wall built to guide it. The shape carried a bundle of dry mesquite under one arm. It came to the fire ring, knelt with a soft grunt of effort, and began, by feel alone, to build up the banked ash into a new small blaze. It was a woman, an old woman, gray hair in a thin braid, a face seamed and darkened by 20 years of desert sun, eyes gone pale and clouded in the firelight. She was half blind, Clara saw. She built her fire by touch, her fingers reading the stones like a face. Clara meant to speak gently. She truly did. But the shock of a living soul in that dead place took the gentleness from her, and what came out was only a whisper. "Who are you?" The old woman did not startle. She went very still, as Clara herself had gone still that afternoon, and she lifted her clouded eyes toward the sound and searched the dark. And when she spoke, her voice shook with something that was not fear at all. It was hope. Terrible, worn, 20-year-old hope. "You came," the old woman breathed. "Oh, I knew you would come back to me. I knew it. Come to the light, girl. Let me see your face. Is it you? Is it my Ruth? Have you come home to your mother at last?" Clara's throat closed. Ruth had been her own mother's name. Her mother, dead these 12 years, whom she barely remembered. She stood frozen in the dark, while the old woman reached toward her with both trembling hands, and she understood, all at once and much too late, exactly who was kneeling at that fire. "I am not Ruth," Clara said, and her own voice broke on it. "Ruth was my mother. She is gone. She has been gone a long time. I am Clara. I am her daughter." And then, because the old woman's face was coming apart in the firelight, she made herself say the rest. "You are Ada Vane. You are my grandmother. They told me you were dead. They told me you died the same year the gold went missing." For a long moment the old woman did not move. Then she made a sound Clara would remember for the rest of her life. A small broken sound with 20 years of grief and joy pressed into it, and she reached out and found Clara's face with her fingers and read it, brow and cheek and jaw, as she read the stones of her fire, and what she found there made her weep without any shame at all. "Ruth's girl," Ada whispered. "Ruth's girl come home. Not dead, child. They only wanted me dead, which is a different thing. Sit by the fire your grandfather kept. There is so much you were never told, and I have waited so long, and my eyes are nearly gone. Sit and let an old woman tell you the truth this valley buried." And so, on the canyon floor, in the light of a fire that a blamed and hated man had lit and his widow had refused to let die, Clara Vane sat down beside her grandmother and began at last to learn who she was. It did not come all at once. Nothing true ever does. Ada was old and her mind moved like her feet, slow in feeling for each step, and the story came out over that first night, and the days that followed in a staircase of small pieces, each one answering a little and asking more. The first piece was the fire itself. 20 years I have kept it, Ada said, feeding the flames, rain and drought, every dusk near enough. Do you know why a body keeps a fire in a place no one comes? Clara said she did not. Ada smiled into the dark. Neither did the valley. That was the point of it. A fire means a keeper, and a gun with a keeper is a gun somebody might still want. And a gun somebody wants does not get sold for scrap and carted off before the truth can be told. Your grandfather worked that out before he died. Keep the fire, and the gun stays. Keep the gun, and the door stays. Keep the door, and the promise keeps. She turned her clouded eyes on Clara. A gun that never fired still keeps its promise. Your grandfather said that to me more times than I could count. I did not understand him for years. I understand him now. The second piece was the bronze. Clara had wondered aloud how an old woman, half-blind, could keep a sight and a breech band so bright. Ada laughed softly and held up her hands, and even in firelight Clara could see the years of small burns and the rag-worn calluses. I do not need eyes to oil brass, she said. My hands learned this gun before my eyes left me. Every part of it I keep so that any soul who ever climbed down into this canyon would see at one glance that this is no abandoned wreck. This is a thing that is loved. And people do not scrap a thing that is loved. They wonder about it. And I wanted them to wonder and be afraid and stay away, all at the same time. The brass says somebody cares. The powder story says come no closer. Between the two of them, this gun has stood untouched for 20 years. She patted the great iron flank beside her as a woman pats an old horse. It has kept every secret I asked it to. Clara asked the question then that had been burning in her since the courthouse steps. She asked about the man. She asked about the swindler. She asked what her grandfather had truly done. And Ada Vane grew very quiet. And the fire snapped, and somewhere up the canyon a night bird called once and went silent. And the old woman said, "He did nothing they say he did." Nothing. Your grandfather was the most honest man ever to wear the territory's dust, and they buried his name in a lie so deep that his own granddaughter grew up believing it. If you want the truth of Amos Vane, you have to understand the harbor that was never there. You have to understand Port Meridian. She reached out and gripped Clara's wrist with surprising strength. Stay with me through it, child. It is a long telling and an ugly one, and there is a family in this valley that would still kill to keep it buried. But you bought this gun. You have a right to know what you bought. And here, before Ada begins the true story, let me pull you back to the fire for a moment, because everything that comes next turns on it. Remember the seal on the door with the mark no one recognized. Remember the fire lit for 20 years so a gun would not be sold. Remember that a whole valley was made to fear a magazine so that no one would ever look inside. Keep all three of those in your mind, like 3 cards laid face down on a table, because the old woman is about to tell Clara Vane how 100 families were robbed of everything. And by the time she is done, every one of those 3 cards is going to turn face up. It had begun 20 years before, in 1869. When the war back east was fresh in the ground and men with clean hands and dirty plans were fanning out across the western territories selling the future by the acre. A company of them came to the valley calling themselves the Meridian Land and Navigation Syndicate, and they were the most respectable-looking thieves the valley had ever entertained. They had maps. They had engravings. They had a prospectus printed on heavy paper with a gold seal, and it showed a thing so grand that grown men wept looking at it. A great inland harbor, they said, was to be dug where the valley met the river country. A canal would join it to the sea. Ships would ride at anchor where there was now only sage. The government itself, they hinted, had chosen this very spot for an inland naval station, a fortified port to guard the whole southwestern frontier, and its name was already chosen. Port Meridian. You have to see it as they were shown it, Ada said, and there was old pity in her voice, even for the cheated, even now. Poor people, hard people, folk who had crossed half a continent with nothing, and here were gentlemen telling them the government had blessed this ground, that a naval town was coming, that the man who bought a subscription lot now would own a shop or a wharf or a home in a city inside 10 years. They believed it because they needed it. Every family in the valley bought in. They pooled their gold, their savings, their soldiers' back pay, their dead husbands' pensions, share by share. Each family's name written in the syndicate's book against the money they laid down. 100 families and more, everything they had handed over for a deed to a house on a street in a town that did not exist and never would. Clara asked the question any child would ask. If there was no harbor, how did anyone believe there ever would be? Because of the gun, Ada said simply. You cannot dig a harbor overnight, but you can prove a garrison is coming, and nothing says a naval station like a naval gun. So the syndicate bought one. After the war, the Army was selling off its old coastal pieces cheap, and these men bought a great Columbiad, a 15-inch coastal gun. And they freighted it 600 miles inland up the only wagon grade into this canyon, and they set it on a raw stone emplacement above the ground where the harbor was to be, over a proper sunken magazine cut into the rock, exactly as a real battery would have it. And they let the families come out and stand beneath it and touch the iron and believe. A real gun, a real emplacement. Surely the people thought no one would haul a monster like that into the desert for a lie. She shook her head slowly. But that is exactly what a lie that size requires. The gun was the bait. And when the last subscription gold was gathered in, the syndicate loaded their money and their maps, and one night they blasted the wagon grade shut behind them, so that no wronged man could follow with a rope and a horse, and they were gone. No harbor, no canal, no town, no navy, only 100 ruined families and a war gun aimed at a sea that would never come. And here, Ada said, was where they needed a thief, because a fraud that size cannot simply vanish. It needs a face to blame, a man to point at, so that the anger of 100 families falls on someone near instead of on gentlemen already 1,000 miles away with the gold. And the man they chose was the old artilleryman they had hired to freight and mount and mind the gun. A retired sergeant, a widower with a daughter, honest and unremarkable and conveniently local. Amos Vane. They wrote it into their own records before they left, Ada said, and her voice hardened. That the tending sergeant had been given custody of the subscription gold for safekeeping in the magazine, and that the sergeant had absconded with it. It was a lie inside the lie. And it worked so well that even the law believed it. For 20 years this valley has told its children that Amos Vane took every family's savings and ran. They have spat his name. They made his granddaughter a leper for it. And all that time, she stopped. Her clouded eyes filled. All that time, child, the gold never left this canyon. Clara sat very still. Where is it? You have knelt on it, Ada said. You have laid your hand on the door that keeps it. The story of that night, the night everything turned, Ada told slower than all the rest, because she had lived it, and it had cost her everything. Amos had been no fool. In the weeks he freighted and mounted the great gun for the syndicate, he had begun to see the seams in their story, the surveys that never came, the government letters no one would show him, the sight of the gentleman counting the subscription gold twice a day and sleeping beside it. And on the last night, when he understood at last that the harbor was a lie and the gold was about to be carried off, one old sergeant against a company of armed men, he did the only thing a lone honest man could do. He did not try to fight them for it. He hid it from them. He knew the magazine better than they did, because he had loaded it, Ada said. It was built for powder. Powder they had freighted up with the gun to make the battery look manned, tons of it in kegs, more than that Kenyon would ever need. On the last night while the syndicate slept over their maps, your grandfather went down into the magazine alone. And he did two things no one ever knew. He drew out every keg of powder, every last one, and he rolled them off into a side fissure and buried them deep, so there was not a grain of it left to threaten anyone. And in the cool, dry chamber the powder had left empty, packed in straw and oilcloth, where no fire could reach and no damp could rot it, he hid the family's subscription gold. Every share. Every family's portion, still tied and labeled with the name of the family it belonged to, exactly as it stood in the syndicate's book, so that one day it could be given back to the right hands. Clara barely breathed. And then he sealed the door, Ada said, and he let them run. He let the syndicate blast the grade and flee believing the gold was in their wagons, because they never dreamed a hired sergeant would empty their money and refill their powder magazine with it. And he let this valley go on, believing that same magazine was packed with live powder that would kill any soul who touched it. Do you see the beauty of it, child? The terrible patience of it? He did not hide the gold in a strong box a thief could carry, or a bank a lawyer could seize, or a hole a treasure hunter would dig. He hid it beneath a war gun, inside the one chamber that every living person in the territory was too afraid to open. He guarded 100 families' fortune with nothing but their own fear. No thief would force that door. No fire would come near it. He made the lie that ruined us into the lock that kept us safe. The tending log came out on the third day. Ada led Clara by the hand up into a dry cleft in the rocks above the gun, where a tin box lay wrapped in oilcloth, and inside it was a ledger of cheap paper, and in the ledger were 20 years of entries, one line each at dusk. Written first in a firm, square soldier's hand, and then, after a certain date, in a second hand, rounder and shakier, a woman's hand going slowly blind. The entries never changed much. Magazine kept. Names safe. Truth waits. Over and over, dusk after dusk, year after year, the same quiet vow written down by a man and then by his widow, so that God and the paper would both know the fire had been kept one more day. Clara turned to the very back and found the last entry in her grandfather's own hand, dated the winter he died, and beneath the familiar words he had added one line more, as if he had known his own strength was failing. Kept for the child of my own blood who will one day carry it home. She looked up at her grandmother in the firelight, and Ada, who could not see the page, seemed to know exactly which line her granddaughter had found, and she nodded slowly. "Now you know why I never opened the door myself," Ada said. "It was never mine to open. He did not hide it for me to give back. He hid it for the one who would come. And I have waited 20 years, half blind and half dead, to this valley, keeping his fire and his brass and his lie, for the sound of the right feet coming down into this dead place. And here you are." She stretched out a hand and found Clara's hands and folded them in her own. The blood he trusted it to. "Will you open it, child? Will you help me give 100 families back what your grandfather saved for them? Stay with me here, because the next thing these two women did, an old blind widow and a banished girl with 40 cents to her name, is the moment the canyon finally gives up what it has guarded for 20 years. And it is not at all what either of them expected to find waiting in the dark beneath the gun. They chose the hour after dawn, when the light came level into the canyon and the stone was not yet an oven. Clara knelt at the hatch with an old iron bar Ada had kept oiled against this very morning, and before she touched the wax, she asked the question that had ridden her since the first day. "The seal," she said. "The mark stamped in the wax. I have never seen it anywhere. Whose is it?" "Break it," Ada said softly, "and I will tell you when it is open. Some things a body has to earn the telling of." So Clara set the edge of the bar against the thick red disk of wax, and she paused, because she understood she was about to break a thing her grandfather's own hand had pressed shut. And then she leaned her weight on it, and the seal cracked clean across with a small dry sound that seemed very loud in that silent place. The iron door beneath had rusted at its edges, but its hinges had been kept. Greased under the wax by a hand that meant it to open one day, and after a long groaning fight the two women together worked it back on its pins until it stood wide, and a breath of cool, dry, ancient air came up out of the dark like the canyon exhaling. Clara went down first, a lantern in her hand, down 4 stone steps cut into the living rock, into a chamber cool as a cellar and dry as a bone. The lantern light swelled and filled it, and Clara Vane stood at the bottom of her grandfather's 20-year secret and forgot how to breathe. The magazine was not heaped with gleaming treasure like a pirate's tale. It was better than that, and stranger, and it took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. Row upon row, stacked on the dry stone shelves the powder kegs had once filled, were small bundles wrapped in oilcloth and bound in straw, each one about the size of a loaf of bread, and each one bearing a wooden tag. And on each tag, in her grandfather's firm, square hand, was written a name. She lifted the lantern and read them along the nearest shelf, one after another, and her eyes filled, because she knew these names. They were the Valley. They were the family that owned the mercantile that would not sell to her aunt. They were the schoolmaster who had seated her apart. They were the woman in black who had wished her grandfather a shallow grave from the courthouse rail. They were the boy at the auction and his hushing mother. Every family that had cursed the name of Vane for 20 years had a bundle on these shelves with their own name on it, waiting exactly as it had been laid down, every family's share still kept apart and labeled and untouched. "It is all here," Clara called up, and her voice cracked. "Grandmother, it is all here, every name. He never took a single share. He kept them apart. He kept them by name." Above her she heard the old woman begin to weep and to laugh, both together. There was one bundle that was not like the others, set apart on a shelf of its own, at the level where a man would set the thing he wanted found last. Was not gold but a flat packet of oilcloth, sewn shut and sealed with another disk of that same red wax and that same unknown dye. Across it, in the firm square hand, were written the words, "For the one of my blood who comes to give it back." Clara's hands shook as she lifted it. It was light. It was papers, not coin. It was, she understood, the thing her grandfather had most wanted to say. And she wanted more than anything to tear it open right there in the cool dark. She did not. Some instinct older than curiosity told her that this was not a thing to be read alone by lantern light in a hole in the ground. This was a thing to be read in the open, in the daylight, perhaps in front of the very valley that needed to hear it. So she carried it up the 4 stone steps into the morning and set it aside, sealed, its meaning still locked inside the wax, and she turned back to the enormous, impossible work in front of her, which was how 2 women, one blind and one penniless, were going to carry 100 families' fortune out of a canyon no wagon could enter and put it back into the hands that had cursed them for stealing. They never got the chance to decide. Because on the 9th morning, while Clara was carrying bundles up from the magazine and stacking them under oilcloth in the shade of the gun, a shadow fell across the slide at the canyon's mouth, and a man came over the rubble her grandfather's enemies had blasted down. And he was not from the valley, and he had not come to help. He was an officer. Even trail worn and dusty, he wore it in the set of his shoulders and the brass on his coat. A spare, precise man of middle years, with a leather case under his arm and 2 hired men behind him, and he stood at the top of the slide and looked down at the great canted gun and the stacked bundles and the 2 women with the flat. Satisfied expression of a man who has found exactly what the paperwork promised. He picked his way down and did not offer his name until he stood before them, and when he did, he offered it like a verdict. "Major Dunmore," he said, "United States Army, Department of Ordnance." And this, he gestured with 2 fingers at the colossal iron gun at the open hatch. At the tagged bundles gleaming dully under their cloth is United States military property. I have ridden a very long way on the strength of an old rumor, and I am pleased to find it true. He drew a folded document from the leather case and let it fall open. It was a federal writ, stamped and sealed, and he read the meat of it aloud in the dry voice of a man who has read many such papers. By authority of the War Department, I am directed to reclaim the ordnance piece known locally as the Port Meridian Battery, being a coastal Columbiad of United States manufacture, unlawfully removed and long unaccounted, to convey it for scrapping, and to impound the contents of its powder magazine as unrecovered federal military stores. He looked up. His eyes went to the tagged bundles, and something hungry moved behind the precision. I will be frank, since we are alone. The department cares nothing for a rusted gun it must pay to haul out. But the contents of a sealed military magazine unaccounted for 20 years, that is another matter. Whatever is in those bundles, ladies, is the property of the United States government the moment I say it is. Step away from it. Ada Vane, who could barely see him, drew herself up straight and put her body between the major and the shelves of names, and her old voice did not shake at all. "That gold belongs to 100 families of this valley," she said. "Every share is labeled with the name of the soul it was stolen from. It is not the Army's. It never was. Everything in a federal magazine is the Army's, madam," Dunmore said, almost gently, "until a court says otherwise, and there is no court within 200 miles. Possession this morning is mine." And he was right, and he knew he was right, and Clara felt the whole thing slipping, the fire kept for 20 years, her grandfather's patience, the 100 waiting names, all of it about to be carried off under a federal seal by a man who had ridden in on a rumor at the last possible hour. But Clara Vane had spent 9 days living inside her grandfather's mind, and she had learned the one thing the major did not know he had gotten wrong. She stepped forward, and she did not raise her voice, because she had learned from Ada that you do not shout down a lie, you simply hold up the thing that ends it. Then you will want to be very sure, Major, she said, that this gun is what your paper says it is. Because if it is not a United States gun, then this is not a United States magazine, and you have no more claim on what is inside it than the coyotes do. And I do not think you have checked. Stay with me now, because everything, the gold, the 100 names, her grandfather's cleared honor and her own, is about to come down to a single mark stamped in old iron, and the man who rode 600 miles to seize a fortune is about to be undone by his own paperwork in front of the one witness he never counted on. Major Dunmore did not like being told he had failed to check something. He liked it even less because he had a soldier's respect for records, and the girl had touched that respect and turned it. He studied Clara for a long moment, and then he did the careful thing, which was also the fatal thing. He went to the barrel to check. Every gun the Army had ever owned wore its pedigree stamped into the iron near the breech, an ordnance mark, an inspector's initials, a registry number that matched a page in a book the department kept. Dunmore had brought that book. It was in his leather case, the federal ordnance rolls, the list of every coastal piece the United States had ever cast, sold, or lost. He knelt at the breech of the great gun, and Clara knelt beside him and pointed to the founder's mark that Ada had oiled bright for 20 years so that any soul would see this gun was tended. It was not an Army mark. It was the mark of a private foundry, a maker's device cast into the metal, a proud commercial stamp of the kind no government arsenal ever used, with a lot number beneath it that belonged to no federal registry at all. "Read your own rolls, Major," Clara said quietly. "Find this gun on them. I will wait." He looked. To his credit, he truly looked, turning the pages of the federal record in the growing heat while his hired men shifted and the two women stood silent, and the longer he looked, the stiller his face became, because the gun was not there. No coastal Columbiad of that founder's mark and that lot number had ever been sold or struck from any United States arsenal, for the plain reason that the United States had never owned it. And then Clara gave him the last of it, drawn from the oilcloth tin her grandfather had kept beside the log. It was a freight and casting invoice, 20 years old, on the letterhead of the Meridian Land and Navigation Syndicate, and it commissioned from a private Eastern foundry one decorative Columbiad, quote, of coastal pattern, for display and promotional purpose, not proofed for service, not for issue. A decoy, a stage prop cast to fool desperate people, never an Army gun, never on any federal roll, never, therefore, sitting over a federal magazine. Your writ is for a United States coastal piece unlawfully removed, Clara said. This was never a United States piece. It is a swindler's fake, and my grandfather kept a proof of it for 20 years, because he knew that one day a man exactly like you would come with a paper exactly like that one, and the only thing that would stop him would be the truth in writing. The government has no title to this gun, Major, and it has no title to a single share in that magazine, because the magazine belongs to the gun. And the gun belongs to no one but the families it was used to rob. Now here is the thing that separates an honest ending from a cruel one, and it is the reason this story is told and retold in that valley to this day. Clara Vane did not gloat. Ada did not crow. There was no speech of triumph, no finger in the Major's face. Instead, Clara did the hardest and the wisest thing. She insisted the matter be settled not in a canyon between three people, but in the open, before the law and before the valley, so that no man could ever say afterward that the Vane women had spirited a fortune out of a hole in the dark. She asked Major Dunmore himself, as a man who honored records, to send one of his hired riders to the county seat for the United States Marshal, and to touch nothing until the law arrived. And because he was, underneath the hunger, a man who honored records, and because he had just read in his own book that the girl was right, he did. The marshal came 3 days later, a broad, quiet man named Reyes, with a badge worn smooth, and half the valley came behind him. Because word of what was in the wash had run through the county like fire through dry grass. They climbed over the blasted slide, the mercantile family and the schoolmaster and the woman who had worn black at the auction, the boy and his mother, the sons and daughters and widows of 100 cheated households, and they stood in the hot canyon and watched a banished girl they had spat upon lay the whole truth out on a flat rock in the sun. She set down the founder's mark and the foundry invoice, and Major Dunmore, to the lasting credit that would follow his name instead of shame, stood before the marshal and confirmed it aloud. That the gun was on no federal roll and the United States claimed nothing here. She spread the tending log, 20 years of one-line dusk entries in 2 hands, magazine kept, names safe, truth waits, so the valley could see with its own eyes that the man they called a thief had knelt in this canyon every evening of his life, guarding what they lost. And last she laid out the thing that turned 20 years of contempt inside out, the syndicate's own subscription ledger, recovered from the sealed packet, written in the private hand of the financier who had run the whole fraud, a man named Harlan Poole. Every family's name and every family's gold set down in his own ink, and beside it her grandfather's tags with those very same names, matched share for share. The fraud was not argued. It was demonstrated in documents in daylight by the dead man's own careful hand, while the living stood silent and let the paper speak. Major Dunmore was undone, but he was not destroyed. He gathered his rolls, and before he climbed back up the blasted grade, he stopped in front of Ada Vane and did a thing his writ never required. He took off his hat. The sealed packet Clara opened last, and she opened it in front of them all, because it was addressed to her blood, and it was time her blood answered. Inside was her grandfather's account in his own square hand, the whole of it, the harbor no one ever dug, the gold he drew from under their feet, the powder he buried so no soul would be harmed, the fire he asked his wife to keep. And at the end of it, a bequest, written to no lawyer and no court, but to a person not yet born. For the one of my blood who comes to give it back, it read, I did not hide this gold to keep it. I hid it to return it, and I could not do that living, for they would have killed me and dug it up. So I hid it behind their own fear, and I kept it by name. And I trusted that one day someone of mine would come, who was strong enough to carry a hated name into this canyon and honest enough to carry a fortune out of it and give every grain of it back to the people who once cursed me. I never knew your face. I knew you would come. The gun was the bait they used to rob you. I made it the lock that saved you. Give them back what is theirs, child, and then you will have done the one thing I could not, and my name will rest. And here at last the final card turned over, the one Clara had knelt beside on her very first day and could not stop looking at. She asked Ada again, gently, whose die had cut the seal on the door, and this time Ada told her. It was Amos Vane's own. He had cut it himself by lamplight in his last winter, a private mark no one in the territory would recognize, so that the day the door was opened, the one who opened it would find on the wax not a warning and not a lock, but a signature. He had not sealed a magazine of powder. He had signed a trust and left it waiting for the hand that would honor it. They carried the fortune home the only way two women could, share by share, over the slide and out of the canyon and across the county that had made the name Vane a curse, and they gave each bundle back into the hands whose name it bore. There was no ceremony. Clara would not allow one. She went to each door, the mercantile, the schoolhouse, the widow in black, and she set the labeled bundle on the table and said only that her grandfather had kept it safe and that it was theirs, and she took not 1 cent of it for herself, though a lawyer told her a finder's third would have been hers by any law in the territory. She wanted no fee. She had not come to be paid. She had come to give a dead man his name back, and a name, once it is clean, is worth more than any third. And 1 bundle she never delivered and never explained. There was a last share on the deepest shelf, wrapped and bound like the others, but bearing no name at all, only a small mark in her grandfather's hand that she recognized, and no one else did. What she did with it and whose it was meant to be, she kept to herself all the days of her life. And if you had asked her, she would only have smiled, because every honest family keeps 1 door it does not open even for the neighbors, and this was hers. She did not leave the canyon. She had come meaning to sell 30 tons of iron and vanish with a stake in her pocket, and instead she stayed, because Ada was old and half-blind and had kept a fire alone for 20 years, and would not be alone for whatever years were left. Clara mended the log with a new tin, and on the first evening of the rest of her life she took up the pencil and, beneath 20 years of 2 older hands, wrote the day's single line in a third. Names returned, she wrote, truth told, fire kept. The gun never fired. It never once needed to. It had done everything a dead man asked of it without ever making a sound, and now it stood over an empty chamber, guarding nothing, harming no one, an old fake, grown suddenly honest, sentinel over a door that at long last had nothing left to hide. Maybe that is the part most of us miss, sitting where we sit tonight. We spend our lives fearing the thing that looks dangerous, the great dark shape on the ridge, the magazine we are told will kill us, the name the whole town has agreed to hate. And so often the danger was never in the thing at all. The gun was never the danger. What it guarded was. Amos Vane understood that, and he turned the fear meant to ruin him into the very wall that kept 100 families safe, and he trusted that patience in blood and a kept fire would outlast a lie. They did. If you've made it this far into the canyon with us, then you already know this was never a story about gold. It was a story about a name coming home clean, about an old woman who would not let a fire die, and about a girl who learned that the thing the world throws away is sometimes the most faithful thing left standing. From all of us, thank you for staying to the end, for sitting by this fire a while, and for letting an old story keep you company tonight. It means more than you know. So let me leave you with the question Clara herself could never quite answer. If you had been 19 and hated and down to your last coins, and a whole county swore that door would kill you, would you have taken up the bar and broken the seal to clear a dead man you never met? Or would you have kept your 40 cents and your quiet safety and climbed back out of the wash and never looked down into the dark at all? Tell us in the comments what you would have done. And wherever you are and whatever fire you are keeping, we hope you will settle in with us again soon.